last week when the lights went out at Facebook, not only was the whole world without the biggest message company in the world, amongst other things, but they also found themselves with a whole lot of time on their hands, which they hadn't had for years and didn't know really what to do with. And fundamentally, they were left alone by themselves, disconnected. There were lots of memes and jokes and some important discoveries about that disconnection. People realized the extent to which their professional and social networks depend on Facebook and its ilk. But at a deeper level, I was really fascinated to see the emotional reactions and kind of deeper gut reactions of so many people when they found themselves disconnected. Apart from the panic of like the phone doesn't work, but the feeling of total disconnection because they are so accustomed to, if not addicted to, being completely plugged into everything and everyone all around them, especially at the level of kind of social connection that Facebook has. We even had revelations about Facebook pretty much at the same time about to what extent they're willing to forego their customer safety for the sake of profit. And the most compelling discovery that I heard in that discussion was the knowledge that Facebook has of how hate generates stronger reactions and more engagement with the site, and that's really why they don't filter out that kind of post, and why in fact they promote hateful types of posts. So that was really interesting. So there's that, whether it's adrenaline or some kind of cortisol, whatever happens when people react to hate, and that's also missing. Whatever it is, people suddenly had to confront themselves. They had to confront themselves as they were now without Facebook, and they had to confront themselves as the feeling of what does it mean that I'm so dependent on Facebook and Instagram for all so many things. Apart from the practicalities of business and social connections, there's the self-esteem, the lack of self-esteem, the hate and the love, and all of those things that people transmit and engage with so strongly at the clearly destructive level of social media. So it was really interesting that those two things arrived at the same time. The warning from an ex-insider saying you really should be careful about what this is doing, and the discovery for everyone of what this is doing, and hopefully something would emerge out of that. I guess I doubt it. I suppose you doubt it too. Things don't change, especially when profit is involved. But thinking about that, it got me also to thinking about the discussion of self that I had a few weeks ago from the Stoic point of view here, and then also some of the writing of Krishnamurti, who I also looked at a few weeks ago here on his writing about freedom. So I started thinking about what happens when people encounter themselves. Tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about what Krishnamurti might comment on what we feel when we encountered ourselves and we encounter the kind of discovery and indeed the fear of what's going to happen. There's no connection to the world. What is that fear? What is that self? What is that world that we so depend on? So the Stoics are saying this is what prevents you knowing the self, and knowing the self is really about the practical thing of knowing what you're in charge of. Whereas Krishnamurti takes the point of view, as many philosophers do, of know what the self is. But Krishnamurti comes from a variety of different angles on that. One of the most fundamental is that of fear. And as I said earlier on, it struck me during this week that so much of what people's reactions to the Facebook outage were about was really about the fear of being cut off, being isolated, being alone, and being unable to connect with anyone else. And that is something that Krishnamurti himself particularly addresses head on. You know, the thing about Krishnamurti as an Eastern philosopher is that he doesn't fit into the typical category of Eastern philosophers who essentially espouse various forms of Vedanta and of Hindu philosophy, of classical Eastern teachings that originally come as far back as from the Vedas, which go back as far as 7,000 years perhaps, and as recently as Hinduism, which teaches many of the same things. And many of the familiar guru figures in the West and in the East espouse those typical Vedantic and Vedic philosophies. Krishnamurti is not of that ilk, although, as you know, perhaps, that he originally was identified as a youth by a Westerner in order to represent a new kind of leader, a new age guru. He eventually in the 20s completely rejected that, and he said all of that is a lot of nonsense and we must get to the core truth of the self. We mustn't look at teachers outside of ourselves and gurus and Bibles and teachings from the other worlds or any of those kind of things. And he disassociated himself with that and said all of that is the illusion which prevents us finding any real truth. So, you know, in a very potted fashion, that's a kind of a core idea of what Krishnamurti was about and what motivated him as he broke away from any organized guru structure, insisting that he wasn't that and no one must pursue that. And through amazing conversations and writings, he helped people find a kind of a rational philosophy that in many ways does match some of what the Stoics talk about, in the sense of this being this very centered around the self and the knowledge of the self philosophy, in order to be able to practically handle the world without things that are not in your control, which for the Stoics largely would include beliefs. Although Marcus himself professes religious belief, the Stoics again say, remember, destiny and fate are one of the circles of self that you're not in charge of. Whatever exactly that may be, you aren't. So whether you believe that's in God's hands or in random fate's hands, you're not in control of that. Let go of that. So in some ways it's like, don't listen to the teachings of the gurus, don't listen to the holy books or those things you're not in control of. Focus on what you are in control of. So that helps, that parallels a lot of where Krishnamurti is coming from, to say ultimately all of those external teachings are not relevant. You must only know the self. So how do we know the self? How do we come to know the self? Well, that is of course something very fundamental in those Eastern teachings that I've referred to, and the importance of doing that, very fundamental in those teachings. And one of the most familiarly understood ways of doing that in those Eastern teachings is through the practices of yoga, which when they come to the West are largely focused into the practice of physical yoga. And many people pursue yoga as a physical discipline which aims to perhaps create more than a physical result. Increase one's spiritual awareness. Some forms of yoga are said to raise the Kundalini energies, which is supposedly a spiritual energy that raises up through the spine and leads towards enlightenment. Actually, Krishnamurti takes those things head on and says, what are you doing when you do yoga really? Firstly, according to him, he points out that yoga was never meant to be a set of exercises. Yoga was meant to be a way of life. Yoga is leading the life in a highly moral, ethical manner, including those principles of not hurting anyone or anything, not hurting yourself, and that means not eating the wrong foods, not taking the wrong drugs or medicines, making sure you get the right amount of sleep, making sure you eat good foods, associate with good people, think on good things, on ethical things, on moral things, do the right thing. Krishnamurti says, no one says stand on your head and do exercise when they say follow the path of the yogi. They mean all of those things. In fact, he says, you really do want to do exercise, and especially as a Westerner, perhaps, you believe that you should, that you ought to, you feel guilty if you don't. All of those things mean that you're then taking your physical exercise, so important in your culture, and combining that, calling that your spiritual practice. So indeed, exercise is very healthy and very good for you, but it shouldn't be confused with an ethical or moral approach to life. It's interesting that initially in Western culture it was. At the dawn of the 20th century, when exercising, as opposed to the hard work of life, all of those things were all about creating also a more moral lifestyle. And you read about the spas and the Kellogg brothers and all of those things, you learn a lot about that, where the culture of fitness came from in the West. And yoga eventually joined it. Yoga as a philosophy had been entering the West since before then. But certainly where we stand today in the 21st century, as we saw over the last many decades, yoga became this kind of quasi-spiritual practice, mostly form of exercise in the West, and kind of substitutes, if you like, for the real yoga. Krishnamurti says, I don't even know why you call it yoga. You should just call it exercise. But he says you can do exercise for the rest of your life. You can do yoga for the rest of your life, and you won't awaken spiritual energies, and nor will the awakening of some higher energy of enlightenment and awareness come into being because you're doing yoga. He says really what happens when you eat right and breathe right and do all the right things in terms of the practice of yoga that we do in the West, exercises, breathing, all of those things. He says, and believing that you're becoming higher and more enlightened, he says really what you're doing is you're putting yourself in a superior position. Do you think yoga is better than other exercises? You're putting yourself in a superior position. When the true self is there, there is no sense of superiority. And the way that he approaches the idea of what the true self actually is. But Krishnamurti points out an interesting contradiction. He says, when you do become aware in that way of your healthier lifestyle and your ever so slight sense of superiority because you're doing the right thing, and even the energy you get from it, because he says exercise will give you energy, but he says that makes you identify this is myself. To Krishnamurti, the self is not self-aware as a separate thing. Self-awareness is two things. It's self and awareness. And he says that's fake. That's the self in conflict. Because that's the self that says, should I do this or should I do that? Oh, I'm being good, I'm going to yoga. Oh, I'm more enlightened than that person. Oh, I'm striving for my enlightenment. Or maybe I'm less enlightened than the next person. But there's this two things all the time. This is myself. There's the self, me, this. This is what it is, what should be. Krishnamurti says, there can't be self-awareness. There can only be awareness. The self is aware. It's not aware of itself being aware. He says the same about consciousness, for example. He says, we question all the time, what is consciousness, as if this is something else. And he says, if you understand that it's consciousness that is saying that you are of the same everything that consciousness is. And he says, well, the answer is, there is only consciousness. Everything is consciousness, even the physical things are consciousness, because there is only the awareness of there is. So he takes the same idea to the self. And he says the self just is the self. It doesn't say, should I this, am I this, will I that. Perhaps in Western language we could say that's the ego that does that. And he says that ego is always there in meditation and in yoga and in studying spiritual books and all those things we do in order to pursue our advanced and ever so slightly superior spirituality are actually separate from the self. They separate us from the self, or they aren't the self in the sense they describe the self as if it were two things. The worse me, the better me. The way I was, the way I should be, the way I get when I fall off the wagon. There's these separate things. And he says that cannot be. Surely the self is the self. It's all the self. So he says, actually, if the me, the self, the ego, is in constant conflict, I should not want, I want this, I shouldn't have that, this desire versus that desire, all those moralistic desires we have, all of that struggle. He says, when that struggle is going on, there is no true self. That is not the true self. Krishnamurti's argument probably would make sense to a Stoic, where he says the only way to find the self is by looking at the self. The only way to know the self is by being the self. There's the self. It's not outside of you. It's not achieved by some special kind of a practice. That wouldn't really make any sense. Surely this is the self. In the same way that he says consciousness is everything. If someone says what is consciousness, it must be consciousness saying what is consciousness, because we're conscious. So if a conscious person says what is conscious, that means consciousness is saying what is consciousness. So the self saying what is the self is separating itself from the self, and it isn't separate from the self. And that's another reason why you probably don't have to look far outside of you to find the self. But a way to also know it, a way to, if you like, put your energy there, to experience the consciousness from there, is to look at your fears. So we got into the subject of the self by me saying, Facebook made me think about everyone left to their own devices, left alone with themselves, disconnected from the world. So first they had the issue of themself, and secondly, they had the fear. The fear, in this particular case, of being cut off, of being isolated, whatever it may be. He says, if you find the root of your fear, you can cause the branches of the fear to wither away. So if he says, because behind every of our fears, all of our fears, is one central fear. So you might have felt being alone, being cut off. Fear of loneliness is one he speaks about frequently. And he says these are all branches of the core fear. So he says, what is the root of fear? Look at it. Invite it in. Don't be afraid. You know what your fears are, whether you're alone, fear of loneliness, fear of cut off, fear of not being loved, fear of not being beautiful, fear of losing your job or losing your relationship. He says, by looking at one fear, your particular fear, you can see the root of that fear. So whatever your fear might be, look at the root of fear, which is in fact the root of all your fears, the root of all fear. By looking at the fear, you become aware, and you are the observer observing the fear. He says, by observing it, in the sense of the observer being the same as the observed, then you have found the root of all fear. So if you observe your fear, you observe the root of your fear, and you try to identify what is that I'm looking at, you realize that it's you that fears. It's you that is experiencing fear. So if you look at the root of fear, this must be you looking at you. You're looking at you. The observer and the observed are the same thing. If you're saying, what am I fearful of? The subject and the object are really the same thing. What am I? What is it that I'm asking myself about myself. What is it that I fear? But it's me that fears. So there's this, the same person that fears is looking at the person that fears and says, what is it that you fear? But by looking at the root of all fear is yourself, surely the root of all your fears is yourself. They're your fears. So that's the easy answer to what is the root of all your fears. It's you. But by observing that and saying, what is the root of all my fears, and seeing that it's me, then you have discovered that through fear itself, you have discovered the root of all fears. The root of all fears is yourself. Do you want to know where yourself is? Well, it's once you realize that I and my fears are the same thing. Using his example of loneliness, he says, aren't we breeding loneliness all the time by our self-centered activities? By our huge concern with ourselves, by our looks, by our looking for likes, by our wanting to be the center of attention, which Facebook is so much about, looking for likes and wanting people to see you, see what you're doing and praise you, or see your pain and feel sorry for you. We know for sure Facebook and its ilk are all about that. There's this whole sense of me, and look at me versus them, and they're better than me, and I'm worse than them, and all of those kind of things. He says, aren't we breeding the loneliness ourselves by our tremendous concern with ourselves and all those things, and our importance of our opinions and our judgments and our attitudes? Krishnamurti says, all those are a form of isolation. He says, throughout the day, for years we have done this, and now we find ourselves isolated. There is a sense of isolation which cannot be penetrated. That brings great fear. And he says, in the observation of that loneliness, the observer is part of that loneliness, is that loneliness. So the observer is the observed, and therefore can't hide from it, can't cover it up, can't try and replace it or fill it up with doing something else or going to church or something like that. So he says, if the observer is the observed, and therefore everything which happens is the observed doing it, then he says you've eliminated the conflict. You've tried to escape from it, but you can't. Now you're faced with it. I am that. I am that. I am that means I don't have to ask any questions. It means I understand that that which fears is me. That which is alone or feels lonely is me. I am that feeling of loneliness. He says truth is not so easy to recognize, because for truth to come, we have to let go of all this pursuit of enlightenment and pursuit of virtue and all of that. He says the virtuous person who is conscious of pursuing virtue will never know the truth, will never find reality. They may be a good person, but that's entirely different from knowing the truth or being truth come into being. He says a virtuous man is a righteous man, and a righteous man can never understand the truth, because to him virtue is about, the covering of the self, the doing all of these yogic things, doing the right things. So when he says, I must be without greed, the state of not greed, which he experiences, strengthens himself. He says, yes, I am without greed. I am good. I am virtuous. I am without greed. And he says, that just strengthens the conflict itself, the self that is separate from the truth. He says that's why it's not only important to be poor in the things of the world, but also in belief and also in knowledge. Believing, studying, attaching yourself to external truths causes you to identify with those things and elevate the self and not know the truth. Love is not of the self. The self cannot recognize love. You say, I love, but in the very saying of it, in the very experiencing of it, love is not. But when you know love, self is not. When there is love, self is not. So the essence of what Krishnamurti says is that by the constant observation of ourselves, by the validation of ourselves, by the failure to recognize ourselves and the truth about ourselves by just being ourselves, we lose our sense of ourselves. By even aiming to improve ourselves and be more spiritual all the time, we lose sight of ourselves. Remember, he says that is not wrong. That's a good person. But that mustn't be confused with the self. The self has nothing, knows nothing, believes nothing. It just is. I am that. Who would have thought Facebook outage can get you thinking about all of that? Definitely need a few more Facebook outages. I'll see you next Sunday at the same time.